The marshal didn't knock. He slid the foreclosure notice between my storm door and the jamb, taped it with blue painter's tape, and stepped back to take a photograph. Sunlight reflected off his phone. June across the street froze with her hose aimed at her daylilies. Kyle, who moved in last year, looked up from his grill and ushered his daughter inside without a word. I wiped soil from my hands onto my jeans and read the bold type. My house would be auctioned in 30 days for unpaid homeowner association fines. There was a number to call if I wanted to discuss options. No one looked me in the eye. The paper crackled when I pulled it free from the tape. I did not feel heat. I felt the same slow cold I had felt once, years ago, watching a city council vote to rezone a working-class neighborhood while residents stood too deep along the walls, waiting to speak to a body that had already decided. I stood on my porch until the marshal's car turned the corner. June resumed watering. Kyle's grill smoke rose without him beside it. The daylilies bobbed. Everything was exactly as it had been 30 seconds before. That was the first thing I noticed about this kind of power, how little it disturbed the surface. The notice was paper. The tape was blue. The camera flash had lasted half a second. And yet, the message was complete, and everyone on the street had received it without opening a single envelope. I went inside and spread the notice flat on the kitchen table. I read it 3 times. The statute cited in the 3rd paragraph was misnumbered. I checked it against the state code I keep in a binder on the bottom shelf of the bookcase. My wife had called it my grievance library, not entirely unkindly, and the correct statute number differed by 2 digits. Small error, the kind a court might dismiss as clerical, the kind that could also mean the whole instrument was defective, depending on the judge and the day. I didn't know yet which it would be. I wrote the number down on a legal pad and circled it. Then I sat in the chair I always sit in and looked at the chair my wife used to sit in, across the corner of the table where the 2 surfaces met at a right angle. She had liked that corner. She said it was the place in the house where you could see both the window and the door at the same time. She was right. You could see who was coming. We hadn't always lived under letterhead. I bought this lake parcel when the roads were gravel, and the neighborhood association was a coffee can that passed around at potluck dinners. We wrote our own covenants on a single page. No commercial fishing, respect the setbacks, keep the lake clean. If you mowed early, you mowed the neighbor's strip too. If someone's car died in winter, you pulled it out. We held our community meetings on plywood tables under a canvas awning my neighbor Frank had rigged from his fishing tent. The whole thing ran on handshakes and the understanding that we were all out here choosing the same kind of life. My wife and I planted the cedar saplings that now shade the western shoreline. She had done her research, spread nursery catalogs across the kitchen table, and circled varieties in pencil, cross-referencing growth rates and root depth and what the soil near the water could sustain. She chose smooth-barked incense and western red. She was not a woman who made decisions carelessly. She planted things she expected to outlive her. She was right about that too. When the farmland north of us started selling off to developers, we paid attention. New families moved in, good people most of them, people who worked hard and wanted a decent place to raise their children. We welcomed them. The coffee can turned into a proper dues account. We hired a part-time maintenance man named Carl, who was reliable and didn't overcharge. We elected a 4-person volunteer board that met in whoever's living room was big enough. The minutes were handwritten and mailed in plain envelopes. It wasn't sophisticated. It worked. The first time I saw Mason Carr, he was standing in the firehouse parking lot in a jacket that cost more than my monthly payment, holding a folder of architectural renderings. He had arranged the meeting without asking us, called it a vision session, and sent flyers to every mailbox in the development. The food was catered. There were name tags. He called us legacy owners in a way that was meant to sound like a compliment and landed somewhere between flattery and dismissal. He said the neighborhood was at a crossroads and that his team had the experience to steward the transition. He talked about amenities, a real pool, a boat launch with lighting, a fitness room in the clubhouse. He talked about property values the way a doctor talks about a diagnosis he's already written down. He wasn't asking for our opinion. He was informing us that change was coming and offering us the chance to feel good about it. People clapped. The food was good, and the room was warm, and the renderings were beautiful. I looked at my wife across the table, and she looked back at me with an expression I knew well. Not alarm, not dismissal, just the particular stillness she had when she was watching something develop that would need to be watched. She leaned over and said, quietly, "He didn't ask us a single question." I said, "No, he didn't." We drove home talking about whether we were being paranoid. We decided we were being observant, which is different. We went to bed and did not discuss it further. Within 60 days, the volunteer board was gone. Mason had managed it through a series of bylaw amendments mailed to residents with a short window to object. The window coincided with the July 4th holiday week, when half the neighborhood was traveling. The amendments passed by default. The new board consisted of Mason himself as president, his project manager, his attorney on retainer, and a woman named Patricia who had moved in 6 months prior and seemed to genuinely believe that Mason's vision was what this community needed. She was not wrong that the community needed something. She was wrong about what. They mailed us a rule book, 76 pages, spiral-bound, drafted by a firm with an address in a city none of us had any connection to. Approved exterior paint colors. There were 47, shown in a grid, and none of them were the color of my fence, which had been there since before the rulebook existed. Permitted wreath diameters. Regulations about the visibility of utility containers from the street. A clause defining nuisance so broadly it could encompass nearly anything the board chose to interpret as disruptive to the community's visual harmony. There were fines for first offense, doubled fines for second, and a compounding penalty structure after that. The book did not define who determined a violation had occurred, by what standard, or what the appeal process was. I read it twice, and then called my wife into the kitchen and read the nuisance clause aloud. She said, "They can use that to fine anyone for anything." I said yes. She said, "When does it start?" I said it already had. The envelopes came within weeks. June's rocking chair, a wooden thing her son had made in a shop class 20 years ago, was reclassified as front porch storage and assessed a $30 fine. George, who had been landscaping professionally for longer than Mason Carr had been in business, received a notice that his work truck constituted a commercial vehicle and violated residential property standards. He had parked it in his own driveway his entire life. My fence stain, a cedar tone my wife had chosen from a hardware store chip, was cited as non-compliant with approved pallet. The fine was $50 with a 30-day correction period. We had 47 approved colors. Mine was not one of them. The notices arrived on HOA letterhead with the development's logo, a stylized lake and tree that had been designed by someone who had never been to the actual lake. They were impersonal in the way that official documents are impersonal. Your name at the top, a description of the violation in bureaucratic language, a dollar amount, a deadline, and a sentence at the bottom about continued non-compliance resulting in further action. Nothing was signed by a human hand. The fines were small enough that most people paid without thinking about it too carefully. That was the design. The first community meeting under Mason's board was held in the elementary school gymnasium. He called it a community alignment session. His project manager stood at the front with a paper scroll, an actual scroll, the kind you unroll, and read from it. Names and violations. 32 households had received notices in the first 2 months. He read them in alphabetical order. June Hartley, front porch storage. George Ibarra, commercial vehicle. There were roof pitch complaints and garden edging complaints, and a complaint about a child's chalk drawings on a private driveway that, the project manager said, could be viewed from common areas. When he finished reading, he invited each named resident to stand and acknowledge their impact on community harmony. June stood. Her hands were shaking. She apologized for her chair. A woman I didn't know, seated near the back, began crying quietly while June spoke. George stood and made a joke about trucks and tractors and got a thin laugh from the people who liked him, which stopped short when Mason did not smile. When my name was called, I stood, met Mason's eyes for a moment, and sat back down without saying anything. There was a pause. Mason's project manager looked at Mason. Mason looked at me. Then, the meeting moved on. On the way out, someone behind me said, loud enough to carry, "Some people think they're above accountability." I kept walking. The parking lot was the worst part. People I had mowed lawns beside for years found reasons to be already in their cars, already pulling out, already on their phones. A man named Don, who had helped me replace my water heater 2 winters ago, nodded from a distance and got in his truck without stopping. 3 women who had been in my wife's garden club separated themselves from me without visibly moving, just that collective adjustment you feel in a social group when someone has been categorized. I drove home alone. On the neighborhood app that night, a post appeared from an account I didn't recognize. "Some folks think HOA rules don't apply to them. The rest of us follow the guidelines to protect our community investment." It had 43 likes by morning. The comments included, "Hope they auction his house and someone grateful moves in," and "People like that drag down everyone's property values," and simply, "Pay your dues." My daughter, who lived 40 minutes away, saw the post and called me. She asked if we were being foreclosed. I said no. She said the post had my street name in it. I said I understood. She said, "Dad, please don't make this into one of your things." I told her I hadn't made it into anything yet. She said she was worried about the grandkids seeing it. I told her the grandkids were fine. She asked me to promise I would just pay the fine and move on. I told her I would think about it. That was the closest I came to a promise. When June stopped by 2 days later with a plate of cookies, she stood in my doorway and lowered her voice before she even started talking, as though the house itself might report the conversation. She told me she had paid her fine. All of it, same day the envelope arrived. "I can't be a target," she said. "I can't do it. You know how people get." I told her I understood. She said, "Do you though?" Not unkindly. She meant it as a real question. She had lived next to me for 18 years, and she was asking whether I understood what it felt like to be afraid of the mail. I told her I was starting to. I mailed a certified letter to the board, requesting meeting minutes and financial statements. State law required a response within 15 days. I kept the return receipt. On day 16, I mailed a follow-up. On day 30, I had received nothing. What I had received instead was another envelope, this one with red ink on the outside spelling, "Final Warning." My original fine had doubled. The letter stated that my pool fob privileges, the boat ramp key code, and my access to the clubhouse had been suspended pending resolution of my account. It cited the nuisance clause and a new amendment about active non-compliance. The amendment had not existed when the first notice was sent. I read that letter at the kitchen table. My wife's chair was across from me, empty the way it had been empty for 2 years. Empty in the specific way of a chair that is not just unoccupied, but unused, that still holds a kind of shape in the air around it. I thought about what she would have said. Not about the legal strategy. She had no particular interest in my legal strategies, which she had told me more than once tended toward the elaborate when a simpler path was available. She would have asked what I actually wanted. Not what I wanted to prove, not what was right, but what I wanted my days to look like 6 months from now. She had always asked that question when I started a fight. I had not always liked the answer it produced. She had said to me, years back, the last time I had taken on a protracted case that cost us, a landlord in the east side of the city who had been illegally withholding deposits from low-income tenants, a case that took 8 months and produced a judgment that the landlord appealed and the tenants mostly didn't see. She had said, "You can't be the world's sheriff." She had not said it with contempt. She had said it with the particular sadness of someone who loved a person who was going to keep doing the thing anyway. She had kissed my knuckles and gone back to whatever she had been reading. She had been right. She was usually right. She had also never told me to stop. I put the final warning on top of the original notice and the certified return receipt and the copy of the state statute, correctly numbered, and I clipped them together. Then I opened a legal pad and started writing. The meeting where everything clarified was held in the high school auditorium. The elementary gym could not hold the crowd, which told you something about how many people had received notices by that point. Mason stood on the stage under fluorescent lights that did him no favors. He looked tired in a specific way, the tiredness of someone who has been performing confidence for too long. He spoke about refining our brand, which was not a phrase any of us had ever used to describe where we lived. He said violations were down 18%, which was a statistic no one could verify because the records hadn't been shared. He said property values were trending upward, which was a claim about the regional market that he was presenting as though it were caused by his enforcement regime. He asked for applause for the compliance team, and a portion of the room gave it. Some people clapped because they believed him. Others clapped because they were sitting next to someone who was clapping, and silence would have been noticed. He then introduced a new bylaw. It would allow the board to impose liens without requiring mediation if a homeowner was designated uncooperative. He explained that mediation had become a delay tactic used by a small number of bad faith residents to avoid accountability, and that the board needed tools to protect the majority who followed the rules. He distributed paper ballots and pens. The woman to my left leaned close and said, "If you vote no, they'll keep a list." The man behind me said, "It's not worth it, just vote yes." I filled in the no bubble. When Mason announced the collection of ballots, he walked the rows himself. No observers. No count conducted in public. He disappeared behind the stage curtain with the project manager and came back in less than 10 minutes. He announced that the measure had passed with 75% approval. He did not show the ballots. He did not invite a recount. He thanked everyone for their participation in the democratic process and adjourned. In the parking lot, I found Serena standing by her car looking at her keys. Serena was an accountant who had moved in 4 years ago from the city. She had bought the house at the end of the cul-de-sac, the one with the bad roof she had fixed herself over one summer. She was not someone given to dramatics. She said, "I counted the hands when he called the vote. It wasn't 75%. I asked her what she thought it was. She said maybe 45. Maybe 50 if you counted the people who raised their hands halfway and then put them down when they saw who was watching. I said that was useful information. She said, "Is it? What does it help us do?" I didn't have an answer yet. I told her I would be in touch. When the lien notice arrived, the formal one, the one that went to the courthouse, the marshal came back. Same blue painter's tape, same photograph. June stood at her mailbox and watched. She did not pretend not to see. She looked at me directly with an expression I couldn't entirely read. It had grief in it, and apology, and something that was not quite pity, but was in that neighborhood. Kyle was not outside this time. The egg came 2 days later. The teenage boy did it on a Saturday morning, apparently unaware that I was sitting in the front room. He threw it from a bicycle at a speed that suggested casual rather than passionate hatred. This was not someone who felt strongly about me. This was a kid whose father had probably made a comment at dinner and who saw an opportunity to participate in what the adults around him had decided was acceptable. His father was walking behind him. He kept walking. He did not slow down. He did not look at my house. I watched him pass the window and thought about what it must be like to raise a child inside a moral position that required that kind of studied indifference to maintain. The social exclusion formalized around the same time. The neighborhood's annual summer barbecue, something Frank had started 30 years ago, passed along to rotating hosts. A genuinely good day in most years was held at the Hendersons' house that July. I had not been told it was happening. I found out from June, who told me she had assumed I knew and then realized I didn't and came by the afternoon before to tell me, visibly uncomfortable with the fact that she was the one delivering the news. She said she didn't think the Hendersons had intentionally not told me. She said she thought they probably hadn't known what to do. I said that was probably true. She said she was sorry. I said it was fine. It wasn't fine, but it also wasn't the point. I drove past the Hendersons that evening on an errand that didn't require that particular route. I am aware of that. The backyard was full. Mason was there, jacket off, holding a bottle of something, laughing with Kyle and a man I didn't know who had the kind of settled assurance in his own body that usually means money or power or both. Patricia from the board was there, talking to three women who were nodding in a way that looked more like agreement than conversation. George was there, in his polo with the development logo, standing slightly apart from the main group near the grill, watching the coals in the particular way of someone who has decided being useful is easier than being social. June was there. She was talking to a woman I recognized from the church group, and she glanced up as my car passed, and then looked back down at her cup. I drove home. I made dinner. I watched the news. I went to bed and lay there thinking about the barbecue and about whether exclusion that came from people's discomfort, rather than their active malice, was better or worse than exclusion by design. I decided the distinction didn't matter much in practice. You end up in the same place either way. The pressure that followed was not one thing. It was an accumulation. The doubled fine, the lien, the suspended access, the social erasure, these were the official instruments. The unofficial ones were harder to catalog. On the neighborhood app, my name appeared in threads I wasn't part of, usually in the third person. He's the one who won't pay. He used to be some kind of lawyer, thinks the rules don't apply. He's why our fees went up. The last one wasn't true. My outstanding fines were a small fraction of the HOA's total revenue, but truth is not the metric for that kind of thing. The metric is repeatability. Say it enough in the right spaces, and it becomes background. I tried once to address it directly. A church potluck, the kind of monthly event our congregation has held longer than most of us have been members. I took a plate and sat at a table with people I had known for years. Not close friends, but the kind of long-term acquaintances that accumulate over decades of living in the same place and attending the same events. I waited for a natural pause in the conversation and said simply that the fines I'd been cited for weren't legally supportable and that I had documentation if anyone was interested. The woman to my right, who had borrowed my chainsaw the previous November and returned it without comment, said, "We're all a little tired of hearing about your legal opinions." The man across from me, a retired postal worker whose fence I had helped repair after a windstorm 4 years ago, said, "Maybe you're just mad because you're being held accountable like everyone else." June was at the next table. She looked at her plate. I excused myself, thanked the host, and left. The humiliation in the gym had been public and formal, which made it survivable in a particular way. You could frame it as institutional, as impersonal. The potluck was different. Those were people who had eaten at my table, who had borrowed my things, who knew my wife. The closing of the circle in that room was not the board's doing. It was organic. People doing what people do when they want to stay comfortable, which is to align with whoever seems to be winning and find a reason to believe that alignment is principled. My son's letter arrived in the middle of all this. He had written it by hand on notebook paper, which he had not done since he was 12 years old and composing something for school. His handwriting still had the particular forward lean it had always had. The letter said, "Dad, the kids are asking questions I don't know how to answer. My wife thinks you're making this worse by fighting. I think you might be right about the legal stuff, but I'm not sure it matters if you lose everything in the process. Please think about whether this is still worth it." He had not signed it love. He had signed it with just his name. I read it twice and then set it face down on the table. I did not call him that night. I sat with the phone in my hand and got as far as finding his contact on the screen and then put the phone down. I thought about what I would say, that I understood their concern, that I was thinking about it, that I had thought about it, that I had spent 2 years thinking about very little else and still could not identify a version of paying the fine that didn't make me into someone I did not want to finish being. I thought about my wife's question from the hospital waiting room. Is this one yours or someone else's? I still didn't have a clean answer. It had started as mine, my fence, my statute, my fine, but it had become something else while I wasn't looking. Or maybe it had always been something else, and I had needed the fence to see it. Either way, I put the phone down and went to bed without calling. My daughter called the next morning. Her neighbor had seen the app posts and asked if her father was being evicted. My grandson, her son, 7 years old, in 2nd grade, had come home with a note from his teacher expressing concern about stress in the home environment. My daughter read the note to me over the phone in a voice that was working very hard to stay level. She said, "He told his teacher his grandpa was losing the house." I said that wasn't accurate. She said, "I know it's not accurate, Dad. That's not the point." I asked what the point was. She said the point was that her son was stressed about something he was too young to understand, and she was tired, and her neighbor was asking her questions about her father's legal situation, and she just wanted it to be over. I said I understood. She said, "Do you? Because it doesn't seem like you do." She did not hang up angrily. She hung up the way people hang up when they've run out of room. That same afternoon, I received 4 text messages from numbers I didn't recognize. "Pay your dues!" "Deadbeat!" "Lawyer boy thinks he's special!" And one that was just a photograph of my foreclosure notice, which someone had apparently photographed from the courthouse records or from the blue tape day itself, with a caption that read, "Found this." I silenced my phone. I unplugged the landline. I sat at the kitchen table with the bylaws binder open in front of me and found the mediation clause. Section 14.3, which required a 30-day mediation period before any foreclosure action could proceed. The board had not offered mediation. The board had not mentioned mediation. The board had moved directly to lien and then directly to accelerated collections. The process was defective. The statute was misnumbered. These were not large things, but they were real things. And in the specific kind of fight I was in, real things were what you had to work with. I mailed a certified demand for mediation. I filed an ethics complaint with the state bar against the board's attorney, citing his role in the mediation bypass and the compounding fine structure. I filed a public records request with the county clerk for the temporary collection order Mason had referenced at the special meeting. I did none of this loudly. I didn't tell anyone except Serena, who I called to let her know the mediation demand was on record. She said, "Good. What do we do while we wait?" I said we wait, and we document, and we don't give them anything to use. She said she was going to look at the association's financials. I said that was a good idea. The board's special meeting was held in the clubhouse on a Thursday evening. The notice was sent certified mail and posted on the HOA website and announced in a social media post that described an urgent session to address ongoing non-compliance issues threatening community stability. The room held 40 chairs, and there were people standing along the back wall. Mason's attorney sat at the center of the folding table at the front. Mason sat to his right. Patricia sat to Mason's right, and next to her was a man I had never seen before who was introduced as a consultant. The screen at the front showed a spreadsheet. My name was at the top of the column. The numbers next to it had grown beyond what the original fines could have compounded to under any reasonable interpretation of the schedule, but no one asked for the math to be shown. The attorney spoke for 20 minutes. He explained that the board had obtained a temporary order from the county magistrate authorizing accelerated collections. He held up the order. He read a passage from it aloud. He explained that under new amendments, foreclosure could now proceed without the mediation period specified in the original bylaws, because the original bylaws had been superseded by the new governance framework. He cited a case from another county, he named the case, where an HOA had foreclosed and sold a property. He smiled when he said this in a way that he had probably practiced in a mirror and thought looked confident. It looked like something else. Mason spoke after him. He said the board took no pleasure in enforcement, but had a fiduciary duty to the community. He said a small number of residents had decided that the rules didn't apply to them, and that the cost of that position was being borne by everyone who did follow the rules. He was careful not to say my name. He didn't need to. The chart on the screen said my name. The seating arrangement said my name. The way a third of the room kept not looking at the back row, where I was sitting, said my name. He announced that the measure had passed. He said the county magistrate's order would be executed. He said he hoped this resolved the matter. People around me shifted. Some clapped. A man I didn't know leaned toward the person next to him and said something I didn't catch, and the other person nodded. I watched Mason's face. He looked satisfied in the way of someone who has found that performance and power can substitute for each other indefinitely, as long as no one in the room has the time or the resources to prove otherwise. He thought he had that. He thought he had it completely. I knew the magistrate's order was limited. I had already pulled it from the public record. Paula at the clerk's office had helped me find it, pulling the file from a drawer with a look that said she had opinions she was professionally unable to share. The order authorized collection inquiry, not accelerated foreclosure. The attorney had read it selectively. That was useful to know. But what I felt most clearly in the clubhouse was not the legal inadequacy of Mason's victory. It was the relief on my neighbors' faces. Real relief. The kind that comes from believing a problem is about to be resolved. The problem was me, and the resolution was my removal, and they believed it was finally close. Some of those faces belonged to people I had lived beside for 2 decades. I sat with that and tried not to make it mean more than it did. What followed was a week I have trouble accounting for in any clean narrative. The daughter-in-law called to say she and my son were considering whether my grandchildren should visit until things settled down. My son called separately to say he didn't agree with her position, but wanted me to understand the strain. I said I understood. He said, "Do you though, Dad? Because you sound like someone reading a script." That landed. I didn't have an answer for it. I said I would call him at the end of the week. I called him at the end of the week. We talked for 11 minutes about things that were not the HOA. When we hung up, I felt the distance between us as a specific weight, dense and located somewhere under my sternum. I went to the hardware store for weather stripping and ran into George. He was in the plumbing aisle. He nodded without stopping. I said his name. He stopped. We stood there for a moment among the pipe fittings. He said he was sorry about the situation. I asked him what he was sorry about. He looked at the shelf. He said he'd heard things were getting serious. I asked him what he'd heard. He said he'd heard I was being foreclosed. I told him the foreclosure wasn't final. He said he hoped it worked out. I asked him if he had received any fines lately. He looked at the shelf again. He said they'd been reasonable. He said the patio project had needed a variance, and they'd given it to him on the first submission. I said that was good to hear. He said, "Look, I'm not against you. I just need my business to keep running." I said I understood. He went back to the pipe fittings. I got my weather stripping and left. That conversation saddened me for a while afterward. George was not a complicated person in the sense of someone who strategizes. He was a person who had learned early that the cost of resistance is paid personally and the rewards of compliance are distributed quietly and consistently, and he had made a rational calculation. Mason had given him a patio variance. Mason had also put a logo on his polo shirt, which was probably not purely coincidental. George would not sign a petition. He would not speak at a meeting. But he had also said he wasn't against me, which was not nothing. George had never said anything he didn't mean. The land was what broke the stalemate open. A month after the special meeting, a glossy brochure appeared in every mailbox in the development. Executive cottages at Lakeside Reserve. 8 rendered luxury cabins, photographed from a perspective that made them look like they were floating above the meadow. The meadow where we held the July 4th fireworks watch, where June's husband had proposed to her, where Carl the maintenance man had kept a push mower in a small storage shed for 30 years, and where kids had been running barefoot since before most of the current residents were born. The brochure said this underutilized community asset was being sold to bolster reserves and insulate homeowners against the ongoing costs of litigation initiated by bad actors within our community. It did not name who the buyer was. It scheduled a vote for a Tuesday at 10 in the morning and included a proxy form pre-filled with Mason Carr listed as the designated voter. Serena was at my door within an hour of mail delivery. She had the brochure in one hand and a printed copy of the association's last 3 financial statements in the other. She had already highlighted the reserves column. "We are not short on reserves," she said. "This is not about reserves." I had already looked up the LLC name on the brochure's fine print, Lakeside Properties Holdings, and found that it shared a registered agent address with Mason's development firm. I told her. She closed her eyes for a moment and then opened them. 15 days, she said. I said yes. We organized fast and badly and adequately. Serena ran the financial analysis and documented that the reserves exceeded industry standards by 30%. Luis, who was a civil engineer and had worked in county planning before retiring, found the easement maps in the county records office and identified a reversion clause in the original land grant. If the common area was sold without unanimous homeowner consent, title reverted to the county grantor. This clause predated Mason's bylaws. It predated the development entirely. It was not in his 76-page rulebook because he had never read the documents that governed what he was governing. June baked cookies. I know that sounds like something from a different kind of story, but she baked cookies and walked door to door with them for 3 days straight, talking to people who hadn't read their mail carefully, people who had signed the proxy form without understanding they were handing Mason their vote. She was not confrontational. She was June, warm and persistent, and slightly heartbreaking in the way she had of making you feel that what she was asking you was the most reasonable thing anyone had ever asked. She came back each evening and told me who had listened and who had closed the door. Some of the closed doors surprised me. Some of the open ones did too. George closed his door. He told June he couldn't risk the patio project being revisited. He said it with evident discomfort, but he said it. Kyle not only left his proxy in place, but told his wife, who told someone who told Serena, that he was looking forward to the cottages bringing in residents who were more aligned with the community vision. He said this. He meant it. He was not a bad person in the way we usually use that phrase. He had simply made a different calculation about what kind of place this was and who it should be for, and Mason's vision happened to match his. My daughter texted me, "Why are you fighting about a field?" I did not answer. The day of the vote was a Tuesday morning in October, cool and bright. Cars parked both sides of the road because the lot was full. People brought their folding chairs and their coffee. There was an energy in the room that felt almost like a real democratic event. And that was the problem, because Mason had engineered it to feel exactly that way. He stood at the front in a blazer with a flag pin and welcomed everyone, and announced that each speaker would have exactly 1 minute, and that questions about procedure should be directed to the board's attorney. June went first. She held a photograph of the meadow that had been taken in 1985, the year her husband proposed. She spoke about what the land meant. She had practiced what she was going to say. I know because she had told me she practiced it, and she got through most of it before her voice started to break. When she sat down, the woman next to her put a hand on her shoulder. Mason looked at his watch while June was speaking. Not conspicuously, just enough that you would see it if you were watching him, which I was. Serena read from her financial analysis. She was precise and calm. She referenced page numbers and line items. She said the word reserves 7 times in 60 seconds, and each time it landed like evidence, which it was. Mason said, "Thank you for your passion, Serena," which was the most dismissive thing he could have said, and he knew it. A young father with an infant on his hip asked whether the sale proceeds would be directed to playground repairs. The attorney said comments were not permitted to include questions. A man in a maintenance uniform, one of the crew that kept the common areas, stood up without being called on and said he wanted to say something. Mason said the comment period was over. The man said he would keep it brief. He said he had been told to remove the swing set from the meadow last spring because it wasn't architecturally consistent with the development's aesthetic standards. He had removed it himself, loaded it onto his truck, and driven away past the kids who had been playing on it that morning. He said he just wanted people to know that had happened. He sat back down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Mason's attorney said they would move to the vote. The vote was conducted with ballots in a plastic tub. No observers from the floor. No transparent counting. Mason disappeared into the back office with 2 board members and came out 12 minutes later. He announced that the measure had passed by 73%. One side of the room cheered. The other side sat in silence of the specific kind that means people are deciding whether to believe what they just heard. Neighbors on our side found each other with their eyes. Someone behind me stood and walked out. I sat still. A man I didn't know patted my shoulder on the way past and said, "Time to move on, friend." I did not respond. We did not move on. Serena filed a public records request that same evening, and by the end of the week had documentation showing the sale price was 22% below assessed market value, and that the Lakeside Properties Holdings LLC shared not just a registered agent address, but an actual physical address with Mason's development firm. Luis wrote up the reversion clause and sent it to the county attorney's office, certified mail with return receipt. I drafted a complaint to the State Real Estate Commission detailing the proxy collection practices and the below-market sale structure. We scheduled a town hall at the church basement. We used the church because it was the one space in our community that the HOA could not control or penalize us for using. Mason's attorney sent the pastor a cease and desist letter claiming we were using the facility for political organizing in violation of its tax status. Pastor Williams read the letter in the church office and called me. He said, "It's still a house of God." He paused. "Also, I've seen a lawyer try this argument before. It doesn't hold." He offered us Sunday afternoon and a key to the side door. Word spread in ways I couldn't fully track. People called people who called people. A woman named Alicia who lived in the third phase of the development, the newer houses, the ones with the smaller lots, came to the town hall with her neighbor and sat in the second row. When the microphone opened, she said she had been paying her fines without question for 2 years and had only recently begun to wonder if the process by which they were assessed was legal. Her voice was steady. She was not someone looking for validation. She was someone who had done a calculation and arrived at a different answer than she had previously accepted. The teenager who spoke, maybe 16 there with his father, said he had been denied access to the boat ramp because his father had been 2 weeks late on dues during a month when his father had been in the hospital. He said it mattered to him because he fished. He said it quietly, without drama, the way teenagers speak when they're saying something they genuinely mean rather than something they've prepared. The man in the maintenance uniform was there again. He nodded when Alicia spoke. He did not speak again himself, but he was there, which counted. Mason responded within 24 hours. He posted on the HOA website that outside agitators and bad faith actors were conducting illegal meetings intended to destroy property values and subvert the community's democratic self-governance. He added a motion to the next board agenda to grant authority to fine residents for spreading verified misinformation about association governance. He sent an email to all residents claiming the county attorney had reviewed the land sale and found it legally sound. The county attorney had not reviewed the land sale. The county attorney had not yet responded to Luis's letter. I knew this because I called the county attorney's office and asked. June received a personal letter from Mason's attorney threatening a defamation claim because she had told someone that Mason had rolled his eyes while she was speaking at the vote meeting. She had not been wrong. He had rolled his eyes. I had seen it. She came to my door with the letter, and she was frightened. Real, specific, practical fear. Not abstract worry, but the fear of a retired woman on a fixed income being told a lawyer might sue her for describing what she had seen. She asked if they could actually do it. I told her a defamation suit over that description would be very difficult to win. She said that wasn't what she asked. She asked if they could do it. I said yes. Technically, they could file anything. She sat down on my porch steps and was quiet for a moment. She said, "Maybe I should write an apology." I said, "For what?" She said, "For causing trouble." I said, "June, you told the truth about what happened in a room you were in." She looked at the lake. "I know," she said. "I just want it to stop." That was the truest thing anyone said to me during the whole of this. Not me, not Serena, not Luis. June. I just want it to stop. That was the experience of most of the people in this neighborhood. Not indifference to right and wrong, not cowardice exactly, just the exhaustion of people who had come to a lake to live quietly and found themselves in a war they hadn't enlisted in. Mason understood this. He had built his whole operation on it. The county attorney responded 3 weeks later. He sent Mason's board a letter citing the reversion clause as a potentially controlling document and stating that the county was reviewing whether the sale had been conducted in compliance with the original land grant. He said the county reserved the right to seek declaratory relief. He was careful and institutional and non-committal in all the ways that official letters are careful and institutional and non-committal. But he had written it and sent it certified, and it was in the record. Mason posted on the HOA website that the letter represented bureaucratic overreach from an office that should be focused on countywide issues rather than interfering with private community governance. He filed a civil suit against the county, seeking a declaratory judgment that the reversion clause was unenforceable. He did a local radio interview in which he said he was fighting for homeowners' rights against government intrusion. He was smooth and measured, and he made it sound genuinely principled. He was good at this. I will not pretend he wasn't good at this. Some people who had been opposed to the sale began to waver, not because they had changed their minds about Mason, but because they were suspicious of the county and the county's motives, and Mason's framing of himself as the defender of community independence against government involvement landed with them. At the grocery store, a woman I had never spoken to, not a resident, a neighbor from the development 2 miles east, stopped me in the produce section and said she had been following our situation and thought Mason sounded like he had a point about government overreach. I said the reversion clause was a private covenant, not a government imposition. She said, "Well, but who decides?" I said the county court decides. That's what courts are for. She said, "That's what I mean. I don't want politicians making decisions about my property." I said this was a legal mechanism that had existed in the county's records for 40 years. She said she just wanted her fees to stay reasonable. She moved to the onions. I understood her reasoning. I disagreed with it, but I understood it. Inside our own group, strain was developing. Luis wanted to hold the public records documentation until the county made its formal decision, on the grounds that releasing it prematurely would give Mason time to counter it. Serena wanted to go to the press immediately because she believed public attention was the only pressure Mason would respond to that he couldn't litigate away. June was tired. Her Tuesday prayer group had asked her to take a break from the HOA topic because some of the women were uncomfortable. She had complied, which meant she had given up the one social space in her week that had nothing to do with the fight. Serena's husband had started looking at housing listings in the next county. He had not told her he was doing this. She found his browser history and brought it to me as though I was responsible for it, which I was not, but I was the nearest available person. I told her I was sorry. She said she was too. I thought about my wife's question again, the one from the hospital waiting room. Is this one yours or someone else's? The honest answer was that it had started as mine and become ours. Not just our group of 4, but a genuinely wider community of people who had been harmed. That widening was real. But the cost of it was also being distributed across people who had chosen to stand up, and they were paying it in marriages and friendships and sleep. And I had to be honest with myself about the degree to which I was asking them to absorb something that had originally landed on me. I could not be entirely clean on that question. I don't think anyone in a long fight can be. We held the town hall. We presented facts and no accusations. We showed the financial statements and the reversion clause and the LLC address documentation without editorializing. People asked questions. The maintenance man in the uniform sat in the 3rd row and nodded at specific points, which was its own kind of endorsement. Alicia asked when we expected the county's formal decision. Luis said he thought 30 to 60 days. She said she would keep her proxy revocation on file until then. She was being strategic and transparent about it, which was more than most people managed. After everyone left, Serena and Luis and I cleaned up the folding chairs in the church basement. We did not talk much. June had left early. She had a headache, which was true, and she was also emotionally done for the week, which was also true. Luis said, "Do you think we're going to win?" I said I thought we had a reasonable case. He said that wasn't what he asked. I said I thought the legal position was sound. He said, "Okay." He stacked his chairs and we went home. That night I sat alone in the kitchen with the refrigerator humming and the legal pad in front of me. I thought about all the people who had told me to stop. My daughter, my son, June in her more frightened moments, George at the pipe fittings, the woman in the produce section. I thought about my wife's voice in the hospital room and the 11-minute phone call with my son and the way my daughter-in-law said drama, as though it were a category I had chosen the way you choose a hobby. I was not certain I was right. I want to be clear about that. I was not certain. I thought the legal position was sound. I thought the behavior was wrong. I thought the harm was real. But certainty is a different thing from all of those, and I did not have it. What I had was the legal pad and the binder and the pencil mark in the margin, and the decision, already made, to keep going until something or someone stopped me. The day the collapse began, it didn't look dramatic. It started with a phone call from Paula at the clerk's office. She said, "You might want to come down here." That was all. She said it in the voice of someone who has made this kind of call before and knows how to make it without making anything official. When I arrived, she handed me a stamped envelope addressed to the Homeowners Association. State Attorney General's Office, Consumer Protection Division. "They filed it with us because we hold the covenants," she said. I opened it and read the first paragraph. The Attorney General was launching an investigation into our HOA and its management company for potential violations of nonprofit governance requirements and real estate transaction law. The letter requested access to all financial records, all meeting minutes, and all correspondence related to the common area land sale. A copy had been sent to Mason, the board's attorney, and the county. I thanked Paula. She looked at her desk. I drove home with the letter on the passenger seat. Mason posted on the HOA website within 2 hours. His statement said the state was wasting taxpayer resources and that his team welcomed transparency and looked forward to demonstrating full compliance. He used the word compliance 4 times in 3 paragraphs. He called an emergency meeting for the following Monday to set the record straight and give our community the truth they deserve. He did not mention that the Attorney General's office had subpoena authority. The county attorney, now with additional momentum, filed a motion to void the meadow sale based on the reversion clause. Mason filed a counterclaim for damages. He claimed the county's action had clouded title and harmed his management company's ability to operate. The counterclaim was ambitious and not obviously frivolous, which was what concerned me about it. Mason was not a fool. He had lawyers who were not fools. The counterclaim was designed to create enough legal noise that the process would become expensive and slow, and expensive and slow was a favorable outcome for someone who had resources, and an unfavorable one for a group of retired people and a nurse and an engineer. But something had shifted. The board sent another letter to residents. It said that malicious actors had invited government interference into a private community, and that residents should stand united against the attack. The letter's tone was different from every previous board communication. Previous letters had been cold and institutional. This one had an edge of something that sounded like panic translated into boldness, which is a specific and recognizable sound when you have heard it before. At the emergency meeting, the room was again standing room only. Mason arrived with a lawyer I had never seen. He introduced this man as the new lead counsel for the HOA, explaining that their regular attorney had a scheduling conflict. He said this without further elaboration. I knew from the bar response I had received, a formal acknowledgement that the ethics complaint was under review, that the scheduling conflict was likely the complaint itself, though I said nothing about this to anyone in the room. I kept it in the drawer it was in. The new attorney spoke for a while about the compliance committee the board was establishing to review documents before any production to the state. He said this was standard practice. He said residents were prohibited from sharing HOA correspondence with outside parties under the confidentiality provisions of their membership agreement. He cited provisions that either didn't exist or were legally unenforceable. He said anyone who leaked information could be fined. He was not as smooth as Mason. He spoke faster than was comfortable, and his hands moved in a way that suggested he was managing something internally. But he was saying the words, and they had the shape of authority, and that was what the room needed to contain, for now. During the question period, Serena asked whether the financial statements for the management company could be shared. The attorney said that information was proprietary to the management contract and not subject to homeowner review. People murmured. June stood and asked whether the meeting minutes for the past 18 months would be made available in light of the investigation. The attorney said minutes would be released in accordance with state law once the compliance committee had completed its review. Luis asked whether the bond that was required to be posted when management transitioned had been posted. The attorney looked at Mason. Mason looked at the wall. The attorney said that question was outside the scope of this meeting. Ellen was sitting in the third row. I had noticed her when I came in because she was sitting alone, which was not how she usually sat at board-adjacent events. She had been Mason's assistant for 3 years before becoming a board member. She was in her 50s, practical seeming, had a daughter at the community college, and a house she had refinanced to make improvements she was proud of. During the meeting, she was quiet. After it, she drove home. 2 days later, she posted a statement on the neighborhood app. She said she had been uncomfortable with decisions made by the board and could no longer in good conscience continue to serve. She said she was resigning effective immediately. She attached an email thread. The thread showed Mason instructing the board, over a period of several months, to disregard my records requests, to file the magistrate's collection motion without offering mediation as required, to time the land sale vote during a weekday morning when working residents couldn't attend, and, here was the line that circulated most widely, to make an example of me, specifically, so that other residents who were considering legal challenges would understand the cost. That exact phrase, make an example. Mason's response was posted within 40 minutes and deleted within an hour. It called Ellen disgruntled and suggested legal action. The deletion didn't matter. The thread had already been screenshotted and was moving through the neighborhood's various group chats in every direction simultaneously. By the next morning, it had reached someone at the local news station who called Serena. The segment aired at 6. The reporter stood in front of the meadow. Serena was interviewed, calm and factual, describing the reversion clause and the lack of audits. She did not say Mason's name once. She didn't need to. The reporter had done their own research. Mason declined an interview and released a written statement calling the coverage biased and politically motivated. The statement ran at the end of the segment in the small text of a "board did not respond to interview request" graphic. He had given them the graphic. The text messages started that evening. People who had been silent for months. Some apologetic, some just informational. "I heard something today, wanted you to know." George left a handwritten note on my porch. I opened it expecting something complicated. It just said, "I owe you an apology." That's all. His handwriting was the same as his speech, clear and direct, no unnecessary material. The Attorney General's office moved efficiently once the subpoenas went out. They pulled bank records for the HOA's operating account and the landscaping company owned by Mason's brother-in-law. They found a pattern of payments, thousands of dollars each quarter over 2 years, to the landscaping company for services that had either not been performed or had been performed by the in-house maintenance staff for whom the HOA was already paying separately. The compliance committee called this a prepayment arrangement. The investigators called it something else. They also examined the management company's licensing documentation and found that when Mason's management company had assumed control of the association, the transition that had replaced our volunteer board, the company had been required by state law to post a bond. The bond requirement existed to protect homeowners from exactly the kind of financial mismanagement that had occurred. The bond had not been posted. It had never been posted. The management company had assumed authority it was not legally entitled to hold, which meant that every fine, every lien, every enforcement action taken over the course of their tenure was built on an authority that did not exist. I will be precise about what that felt like. It was not triumphant. It was disorienting in the way that learning a structural error has occurred is disorienting. The sense of, everything that happened because of this, and this should have been caught before the first envelope was sent. The fine for June's rocking chair should have been impossible. The notice about George's truck should have been impossible. The final warning in red letters on my kitchen table should have been impossible. It hadn't been caught. It had run for 2.5 years. That was the realistic thing to absorb, and it sat heavier than any victory. Residents talked openly at the grocery store. People who had avoided me for months made eye contact. A woman I didn't know, not a direct neighbor, said she had followed the story in the local news and wanted to tell me she thought I had done the right thing. I thanked her. I meant it, and I also didn't know exactly what to do with it. Kyle found me at the mailbox one morning. He said, I was wrong. He offered to help repair my dock. I told him I would let him know when I was ready to deal with the dock. He nodded. He did not press. That was a different Kyle than the one who had said the cottages would attract the right people. I don't know which one was more true. Maybe both. The board's last move was a vote to dissolve the HOA entirely. They announced this as a measure to return governance to residents and protect against judicial overreach. The vote was scheduled for a Thursday evening, and the ballots were to be dropped at the management office, which was Mason's office, by Friday noon. Serena read the bylaws and found that dissolution of the association could only be executed by a court, not by a board vote. She and Luis drafted a one-page explanation, and we walked it to every door on the main street and the 3 cul-de-sacs. We told people the vote was not valid. We told them how to verify it themselves. On Thursday evening, 30 ballots were deposited. Mason announced dissolution had passed. The county issued a notice the next morning stating that the vote had no legal effect. The Attorney General filed for a temporary restraining order against further board actions, pending resolution of the investigation. The order was granted by a judge who appeared to have read the filing carefully because the ruling referenced specifics. The board's authority to act was suspended. Mason resigned 11 days later. His letter thanked residents for the privilege of serving and attributed the investigation to a small but vocal minority who placed personal grievances above community well-being. He said he was proud of what his team had accomplished. He listed amenities: the pool, the fitness room, the improved boat launch. He said he hoped the community would continue to grow in the vision he had established for it. He did not mention the bond. He did not mention the landscaping payments. He put his house on the market 7 days after the letter. The listing price was reduced the first time within 2 weeks, the second time 6 weeks after that. The board's attorney withdrew from representation. The bar reviewed my ethics complaint and, 4 months after I filed it, issued a formal reprimand. Not disbarment, not suspension, but a reprimand that would sit in the attorney's record in the state's public database for anyone who looked. One more document in a drawer. It mattered and it didn't matter, and I filed it in the binder. The state concluded its investigation with fines levied against the management company and restitution orders requiring repayment to the HOA of the amounts funneled through the landscaping contract. The county voided the meadow sale. The land was deeded to the county as permanent public green space, which meant Mason could not come back and try again in a different form. A receiver was appointed to manage the association through an election. The election was held on a rainy Saturday. Community hall, folding tables, paper ballots, no proxies. Anyone who wanted to observe the count stood next to the table and watched. The winners were a retired teacher named Dorothy, a nurse named Marcus, and Luis. Serena was elected treasurer. She had run on a platform of full financial transparency and regular audits, and she had gotten nearly 80% of the vote. June volunteered for the social committee. Kyle helped organize the playground repair crew. George attended the first 2 meetings, sat in the back, said nothing both times, and did not come back after that, which was fine. The arguments at subsequent meetings were about budgets and maintenance schedules and whether the pool should close the second week of September or the last. The arguments had the sound of people who disagreed about something manageable. That was not nothing. The court appointed the receiver to manage the association during the transition period. Ballots were counted in the open. I stood in the back. I did not volunteer for anything. I shook hands with the new board members and wished them patience and walked home while people were still on the lawn outside, exchanging cautious warmth. My mailbox held no certified envelopes. There was a flyer about a spring cleanup day, the first community event organized by residents in several years. I took it inside and set it on the table. Mason's "For Sale" sign came down eventually. A young couple moved in with 2 small boys. They waved at anyone who passed. Some people waved back. Others were still working up to it. Kyle crossed the street to introduce himself the first week, hand extended, easy and welcoming. I watched from my porch. I thought about the time Kyle had said the cottages would attract the right people, and I thought about how Kyle had probably already smoothed that sentence into something else in his memory. Not erased it, but sanded it down, the way you sand something you don't want to look at closely. I understood the impulse. I had done it myself, with other things, in other years. June came by with a pie and apologized for everything she had said and not said over the course of 2 years. We sat on my porch steps and ate without plates. She cried when she talked about the meadow and how afraid she had been. She asked if I would attend the next HOA meeting now that things were better. I told her I didn't know. Serena stopped by later in the week and asked if I would review the new bylaw draft before the first formal meeting. I took the packet. I set it on the kitchen table. I did not open it that night or the next. My son and his wife brought the grandchildren over on a Sunday afternoon in late October. The kids ran through the yard the way they always had. My daughter-in-law stood in the doorway with her purse in front of her with both hands, which is how she stands when she is managing herself carefully. I offered coffee. She declined. After a little while, she said, "It's nice that the drama is over." I said yes. We did not talk about letters or fines or liens or the months when the grandchildren weren't brought over. We watched the kids build a dam at the edge of the lake with flat stones. The water worked around the stones and through the gaps and found its level the way water always does. I watched it and did not say anything about it. At the spring cleanup, I showed up with a rake. It was a Saturday in April, overcast, cool enough for a jacket. People I hadn't spoken to in 18 months were there with garbage bags and work gloves. We raked the meadow and pulled the invasive vines from the fence line along the north property and cleaned out the boat ramp drainage grates. 2 people nodded at me and kept working. One woman, the one whose husband I had loaned the chainsaw to, walked past me twice. The first time she was heading toward the brush pile. The second time she was coming back empty-handed. Both times she looked slightly past me, not at me and not entirely away, in the specific way of someone who knows they owe something they haven't found the words or the moment for. I did not speak to her. I raked my section of the meadow. The cleanup took 3 hours. At the end, Dorothy, the new board president, thanked everyone and said there would be coffee and donuts on the back table. I got a cup and drank it standing near the fence. A man I didn't know nodded at me. We stood there a moment. He said, "Nice day for it." I said it was. We went back to the table. Months after the cleanup, people still whispered at the grocery store, not about rules anymore, but about each other, who had said what, who had signed what, who had been where when it mattered. The whispers were smaller and less pointed than they had been, but they were there. That is how communities metabolize this kind of thing, not cleanly, in pieces, over time, sometimes not at all. George came by one afternoon with a replacement bearing for my boat lift. He had found it at a marine supplier and brought it over without calling first, the way he had always operated. He apologized again for not signing the petition. I said what I had said before, that I had done things in other fights I wasn't proud of. He didn't ask what. He showed me how the bearing seated properly and told me it should hold through the season. He drove away in his truck, which he had repainted, and the logo was gone from the door. I don't know if that meant anything. I noticed it. The man whose son had thrown the egg at my mailbox nodded at me when we passed on the road. He didn't speak. I didn't speak. We had established this as our transaction, and I was content to maintain it. There were worse arrangements. Someone spray-painted "Thieves" on the back of the county's green space sign. Someone else painted over it within a week. Rumors started about a development going up 2 miles to the north, new roads being surveyed, farmland selling. A woman at the post office said, "Let's hope we don't get another Mason." She said it to no one in particular, No one laughed. I thought about it on the drive home. The specific fear in that sentence, not of the outcome, but of the repetition. The exhaustion of having to be vigilant again. I understood it. I also knew that the next Mason would come eventually, in one form or another, in this neighborhood or another, as long as there were assets to extract and processes to exploit, and people who just wanted to live quietly and were willing to pay to avoid conflict. That was not pessimism. It was just the shape of the thing. I spent my mornings sanding the cedar table my wife and I had built together the second summer after we moved in. We had done it in sections. Legs and frame one weekend, the top the next, the finishing work over 2 evenings after dinner. She had insisted on hand sanding the final pass because she said power tools left a subtle, directional grain that you could see in certain light. She was right. I had tested it once with a random orbital sander, and she had held the panel at an angle and shown me the faint difference and said, "See?" I had seen. The finish was worn through in places, from years of elbows, coffee cups, the grandchildren's art projects, one winter when I'd left it uncovered and the frost had worked into the grain. I was taking it back to bare wood in sections and refinishing with the same product she had chosen. The work was slow. The dust was fine and fragrant and settled on my forearms in a pale film. I worked in the mornings before it got warm. The chair where she used to sit remained across the corner from mine, still in its place. I had not moved it. I was not ready to move it. I didn't know what it would mean about me if I did. I had promised her I would choose our life over my compulsion to fix things. She had known, when she extracted that promise, that I would break it. She had extracted it anyway, I think because she needed it to have been said, to have been heard, to be part of the record between us. And because she was right about the trade-off in the abstract, even if she understood I couldn't fully live inside the abstract. I had broken it. I had also kept the land she planted trees in. I was not sure how to reconcile those two things, and I was not sure reconciliation was the right goal. Some things you sit with at an angle, and they don't resolve. You just get used to the specific way they don't resolve. I found one of her pencil marks in the binder again, later. Not the setback clause mark I'd found early on, a different one. This one was in the covenants, the original single-page document, next to the line about keeping the lake clean. Just a small vertical line, the kind you make when you're reading carefully and something is worth noting. I don't know when she made it. It could have been any of the times she picked up the binder over the years. It could have been the week we moved in. I sat with the binder open on the table for a while, and then put it back on the shelf. I reviewed the new bylaws eventually. Took me 3 weeks to open the packet, but I opened it. I found 2 provisions that needed clarifying language, and one that could be interpreted in a way that concentrated too much authority in the treasurer's role, which Serena would need to know since she was the treasurer. I wrote notes in the margins in pencil and left the packet on the table for Serena when she came by for coffee the following Thursday. She read my notes and said, "You should be on the board." I said I was going to sit on my porch for a while. She said, "Fair enough." She took the packet and left. We drank the coffee first. At night, I walked to the edge of the lake. Not every night, but often enough that it became a thing I did rather than a thing I decided to do each time. The frogs ran through their different registers depending on the temperature. The water held what light was left in the sky. The legal pad I had used to track violations sat on the kitchen shelf where I had put it after the investigation closed. Sometimes I looked at it when I walked past and felt something that was approximately relief. Sometimes what I felt was cooler than that, something closer to the specific unease of having been right about something you would have preferred to be wrong about, because being wrong would have meant the thing hadn't happened. The new family's porch light glowed across the water. I could hear their boys some evenings, not the words, just the pitch and rhythm of children who are playing rather than managing. It reminded me of the early years here, when the rules were one page and the dues went in a coffee can, and everyone who lived here had arrived by choice, and the idea that a person could lose their home over a rocking chair would have sounded like something from a different kind of place. We had not been naive. We had been human, which includes a certain amount of not knowing what you're not watching for. I did not know yet whether this neighborhood would hold. I meant hold in the deeper sense. Whether the trust that had been broken would repair itself, whether the people who had chosen the wrong side when it was easy would be trusted again by the people who had chosen the harder one. Whether the resentments that had formed in 18 months of social war would dissolve or simply go underground and wait. I had been in enough long fights to know that legal victories do not rebuild what social conflict dismantles. You can win in court and lose the neighborhood. The court paper goes in a drawer. The neighbor who didn't wave back is still there every morning. The wind came off the lake. Low, consistent, indifferent to everything that had happened on this shore. The highway hummed in the distance. Something moved in the reeds along the south bank. A heron, probably, lifting off without hurry, clearing the water and disappearing into the dark above the tree line. I stood until the cold reached my hands. Then I went inside. The table waited for me in the morning. The chair was still there. The legal pad was on the shelf. The binder was on the bookcase with the pencil mark in it. Some of the trees my wife had chosen were 40 feet tall now. The roots were deep in the lakeshore, and they were not going anywhere. I turned off the kitchen light. The house was quiet. I went to bed.